I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rosemary, and I lead talent acquisition for M13. And today's discussion is demystifying the offer process. Compensation and offer negotiation are two things that I get asked the most about by my friends and during career conversations. I found that a large swath of the population have a hard time understanding what makes their market value and how to translate that into an offer at a specific company, as well as how to negotiate asking for a fair price. Of course, this has been a big topic of discussion as we think about equality and diversity. We are hoping that this webinar will provide insight for all levels and types of people, but with a specific focus on groups who may struggle to know and communicate their value. At M13, we are big believers in community as a core value, and for our talent community, that means setting them up for long-term success wherever possible. Before we jump into the conversation, I wanted to stress that we would like for this to be a dialogue. So please ask questions and share your thoughts in the chat, and I'll do my best to get to as many as possible. To kick off that conversation, I'd like to hear from the audience via the chat feature what you think is the biggest mistake people make when receiving an offer. And then we'll discuss your thoughts with the panelists at the end of the session. Now, I've just talked at all of you, and I have two other amazing HR and recruiting leaders here, so I will jump in and introduce them. Liz Morgan has 20 years of recruiting experience, which includes hiring for engineering, business, and executive leadership positions for startups and established companies, including Microsoft and LinkedIn. Currently, she heads up global business recruiting at Square and leads a team of 11 focused on global hiring for finance, legal, IT, communications, and a people function. Liz has spent the majority of her career playing an instrumental role in building diversity recruiting strategies that allow companies to attract and hire world-class talent at scale. Mallory Mazur is an HR and recruiting consultant at Scalable, where she worked with a number of high-growth tech startups in New York and LA as an interim head of HR, trainer, and recruiter. She leveraged her history of hands-on experience for her past roles at startups, including First Dibs, Rent the Runway, Yext, and Hudson Boulevard Group. She is certified as a professional HR Human Resources SHRM SCP and graduated from University of Michigan and the Quant School of Business and Technology MBA. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yay. Well, I'd like to start the conversation with a really broad question, and then we can kind of double click on the pieces. So where I'd like to start is, as you think about preparing an offer as an HR and recruiting professional, what do you think about in terms of the pieces of the offer? And then how do you think that should inform how candidates think about offers? Happy to let either of you start.
Liz, do you want to go or do you want me to start?
Go for it.
Yeah, so I think, hopefully there's been a conversation going on throughout the entire process where you've really understood the candidate's motivations and what they're looking for. So that way, when they're getting the offer, you're able to kind of connect the dots and it's customized to them. So if they're looking for career growth or if, benefits are really important to them, and their families, just making sure that you're really connecting those dots and customizing that offer for them and ensuring that they feel good about what they got, and also all of the questions that maybe were brought up throughout the interview process have been answered, so that way they can make an informed decision.
Do you have anything?
Yeah, and to your point, Valerie, I also think about, outside of candidate motives and what's important to them, I also think about A, their experience, B, what they're looking for next, and C, the role that they're interviewing for. Does the scope increase? What's the level of impact in terms of their transition from current role to the role that they're interviewing for, and how I can potentially create an offer that would entice them enough to accept.
Yeah, those are great points. So in terms of those pieces of offer, I know that a lot of times candidates have a hard time deciphering, what pieces are negotiable and why the offer's been set up in the way that it has. Mallory, since you are such an expert in the HR space beyond just recruiting, can you talk to me a little bit about all of the pieces of an offer that you think candidates should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think kind of taking a step back and like thinking about the company itself and where they are. So if you're like looking at an early stage company, they might be leveraging equity more so than base compensation. I think a lot of times the first thing that people come to mind when they're negotiating is like, what is the cash I'm taking home every day? But that's not the only piece that you should be looking at. So like if you're looking at an early stage startup, you're probably looking at a lower base salary than, like the Facebooks, the Googles, the Netflixes of the world, where they're going to have a higher base salary. And then equity will probably go down as you go into like a mid stage, and then maybe even lower on a late stage startup, but hopefully that base and the benefits have gone up if you're going to a later stage startup. So understanding where the company is at, and then thinking about the different benefits and whatnot that are available. Is there flexibility? Like, are you able to work from home? And are they helping you with education expenses? There's all these different things that you can look at, like what are the benefit costs, like what is actually covered versus not. Are there different social things that they could be doing for you? I know most of us are probably not in the office right now, but some companies have amazing offices with full kitchens, catered lunches, all those kinds of things. Transit benefits. There's all these different things that you can potentially look at. Another thing that some people might negotiate for is like a bonus plan or sign-on bonus, relocation. There's a number of things that you can look at besides just that base compensation, which I know is usually top of mind for a lot of people. But I think most importantly, like Liz talked about, do you want to work there? Like, do you like the people that you've interviewed with? Because money is important, obviously, but more importantly, are you going to be happy? Are you going to be fulfilled? Like, is this the right next step for your career? So don't let the dollars always take away from what's probably more important, and is your happiness and career growth.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, Mallory, I'd also like to add, I would definitely inquire about performance reviews. So if you're going to a late stage startup, let's focus kind of on the privately held companies. I would also really hone in on the fact, okay, I might not be getting the equity piece, this might not be liquid. Cash might be a little bit on the heavier side, but then what does that look like long term? Right? So, what percentage of base salary will increase as a result of a good performance review? Are there equity refreshes during performance reviews? I would look at, inquiring more about, 12 to 18 months out, how will your salary increase, especially if that company is private. Most times, they may or may not have a bonus plan if you've done well. They may have limited amount of increases to base salary. So I definitely inquire and get all information needed to understand, not only like in terms of just accepting the offer, but looking at, 1 to 2 years out, how will your salary increase over time if you do a good job.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And I think that differentiation that you're both making in terms of company size and stage, that will really impact the package that's being offered to you. And it may also very much impact the role that you have as well. I know for me, when I started my career at a big enterprise company, a lot of times I was very siloed. I focused on one part of the business, but I had a lot of stability, probably a lot more cash, but definitely less equity. And then when I moved into startups, I had the ability to do a lot more, but definitely took more risk on the cash side. So I think that's important as you start looking in the market and looking at different opportunities, realizing that if cash is critical to you, you may not want to start talking to a startup. Although, there are other perks that they may provide that other companies don't. Let's see here. So while we talk a little bit about, actually, let's jump into this one. So during the recruiting cycle, now we're already talking a bit about money. When do you think it's the best for a candidate to start bringing up compensation or their expectations for an offer?
I personally believe early and often. So if, expectations change throughout the process, definitely letting your recruiter know. I think usually, and especially when I'm recruiting, that's like, in that initial call where we're going over the opportunity and their background, I am gauging like what their expectations are. I think it's important to note that, it is illegal for recruiters to ask you what your current salary is in a number of states, but obviously double check your state. But I would say early and often, so that way you guys are aligned and there's no surprises if and when you get to that offer stage where you're totally off base, because obviously everybody wants to make sure that you're excited about the offer and also that you are getting what you're expected, so it's an easy close.
Yeah, that's a great point. I noticed actually today, one of the laws in Colorado just changed. So you're no longer to ask candidates about their compensation in Colorado. I think generally it's just a good idea to think more about what market value you want to have and knowing kind of your target range. Liz, that's actually one thing that when friends ask me about having offer conversations with recruiters, it's how do they know their market value? How do they know what's a competitive compensation to be asking for? Do you have any recommendations on sites or how to think about that?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. I'm having some audio issues. So I definitely take into consideration, obviously, my experience and the industry I'm working in. I leverage a lot of sites like PayScale. I know LinkedIn has a salary tool that also references just general compensation ranges.
Mallory, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I would. So we do compensation and we actually help companies a lot with, figuring out leveling and banding and helping them come up with offers that are in market for different companies and also equitable internally. So I would say that those sites can sometimes not always give you the exact result that you might be looking for, but they are really great resources. So I would just take them with a grain of salt. The more that you dive into that data, the more unreliable it can be. So like, for example, like anyone can go on to a lot of these sites, especially like Glassdoor. Like I could go on there right now and say that I'm a software engineer making $500,000. So I think Liz's recommendation of, chatting with your peers, or not your peers, people in your network and whatnot, and understanding what the ranges are for that type of job. Maybe it's, maybe one of your old managers, or, really just leveraging your network to understand, but also taking into account, again, what stage and size is this company at and what's the scope of your role. So like a director at a 50-person startup is completely different than a director at a 1,000-person company. Even though they have the same title, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to command the same salary. So that's just something to keep in mind. So the more information and data points that you can get, the better. So really leveraging that network, your alumni groups, and just different communities that you can be a part of, so that way you can get a better understanding of what your market value could be.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Let's see here. We have a question from the audience, but it's on negotiating, and I'll get to that in a minute. I wanted to talk a little bit about when candidates do start negotiating, what do you think about timing wise? Like, when should candidates, are they forced to always give an answer right away, or do they have time to think about an offer? I know that's another big question we get a lot is like, what about exploding offers? What do I do about that? Liz, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I mean, I think with timing, it's okay to set the expectation that you want several business days, obviously, to sit and think through the offer and then compare other offers coming in. I definitely recommend for candidates to express gratitude and share your excitement that you're receiving an offer and that it's, an important decision to make and that you'd like to have, 1 to 2 business days to think through over responding to it. So that's definitely okay to buy some time in order to make sure that you're making the right decision for you and your career.
Great point.
Yeah, 100%. I think, again, going back to like the communicating early and often. So like, hopefully the recruiter or the hiring manager has an understanding of where you are in your process. So if you're like finishing up another process and you want to wait in order to, make that decision, hopefully it's not going to be like weeks and weeks, but, maybe it's a couple extra days. I think that's, super important, and hopefully that, the companies that you're interviewing with allow you to have that time. So that way you feel like you are making the best decision and not a quick one. So yeah.
Awesome. And so that goes really nicely into this candidate's or this person in the audience's question is about expectations of how you communicate a counter. You've received a verbal offer. Should you reply in written form, or should you give the recruiter a call? Actually, more broadly too, I'd love to hear from both of you. What is a good way to counter? Do you want to take that, Mallory? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, something that always comes up is, am I okay to like counter? Are they going to take the offer away? And I do want to address that might be a red flag if the company immediately just says, oh, if you are trying to negotiate this, like the offer's off the table. Probably not the best place for you to be working. So I think that people expect that you may negotiate or have questions about the offer. So don't be afraid to do that. I think it comes down to your personal comfortability. Like some people really need to think about everything, and it's better to have it all written down. But then again, to Liz's point, making sure that you are showing gratitude. I'm super excited about this offer. I just have a few questions that, I'd love to get some clarity on. Asking the question like, is there flexibility in the base salary or whatever, the thing that you're trying to negotiate, and having like a specific ask. So like, I would be more happy as we discussed, being in this range. Is there any way that, we can get to that point? I mean, fine being flexible. Again, like, thinking about sign-on bonus, additional benefits, maybe there's a work from home budget. It may not even be monetary. I've seen some people, negotiate like an earlier review, or, my compensation will reviewed if they don't have an annual performance cycle. Maybe it's, after 6 months or a year, we'll have a review conversation. So that way we can, at least have that conversation. Obviously you can't guarantee anything, but that might be a good way to think about it in that way as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Liz, are you able to hear us? Do you want to talk a little bit about good counters? I know she's having audio issues. Mallory.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, great. I think just to piggyback off of what Mallory said is definitely always counter. Leverage data in addition to your experience to present a counter offer, and don't always go for the obvious, which is base salary. You can always negotiate a sign-on or negotiate a sign-on over multiple years, depending on the role and level that you're looking for. In addition to that, again, I've mentioned performance reviews. So understanding the cadence and opportunity to increase your base salary or equity and performance reviews, and maybe asking to be rewarded that ahead of time could also definitely play a role. Equity is another opportunity for you to negotiate, but again, it needs to be in line with your experience and your market value.
Yeah, and then just one other thing I'd love to add is, sometimes they are unable to negotiate on salary because of internal equity. So, that's something that a lot of companies are doing a lot more work on is, looking internally and seeing where different people are at the same level and making sure that there is equity there. So they may not have that flexibility on the base salary. So that's just something to, also keep in mind when thinking about that.
Yeah. Mallory, you brought up a great point in the beginning of this topic where you talked about a company's culture and the thoughts around negotiation. I know for us here at M13, because we are a fund, we put a lot of our money towards investing in companies. And so we have a pretty tight budget. And so a lot of times we'll talk with candidates throughout the process exactly what the compensation is we're targeting. I'm always happy to have a discussion about it, but there really isn't a lot of wiggle room. How do you think about companies' cultures and how that affects the negotiation process?
Yeah, I think it can say a lot, in just how the company is. So, like going back to like exploding offers and making candidates make a decision within 24 hours, or I've even heard horror stories where people like had to give an answer on the phone call.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it says a lot. So, really thinking about that and how the company has, presented the offer, how they, really listen to you and what you have discussed with them and what's important. And are they excited? Like, do they show excitement on the call and how do they extend the offer? I think it just says a lot and can give you a lot of clues into what it potentially would be like to work with them.
Yeah. I know, for example, Salesforce, because it is a very sales-driven company, they want to negotiate. They want to have, the tough conversations. And if you're uncomfortable doing that, and like you're saying, maybe that's not the right role or the company for you. So maybe you enjoy negotiating. That could be a better fit. Liz, do you have any thoughts around? Oh, looks like we may have lost Liz. Okay. So I got another question that came through the audience, Mallory, and I'm guessing you'll have some insight on this. So how often do you see pushback from hiring managers and compensation teams on compensation numbers that candidates offer? And generally, how do you help manage candidate expectations along with internal equity as well as the levers within the team?
Yeah, I think, again, going back and kind of like drilling into this, like early and often, like always, having that conversation if, expectations change and hopefully, again, when you get to that offer stage, there's no surprises and you're getting an offer that is aligned, but maybe you got another offer that was more, I think there's, certain situations where the ask is not something that the company can do. But most of the clients that I've worked with and roles that I've helped fill, usually we're not having extraordinary asks where it's, like totally out of budget, or the candidate understands, okay, because of our internal and, what's been communicated to me and the range of what they were looking for, this is aligned. So hopefully, that's not happening too much, but, it definitely still happens. And, I hear, things from different clients, where, candidates maybe saw something on Glassdoor, especially where they think that they are the top of the range. And maybe that data had come from, someone at a much larger company or had a different scope of role with the same title. And, the market data actually supported them being at a lower range. So it definitely still happens, but, you know, hopefully again, that you've communicated it and on both ends.
Yeah, I think that communication part is so important. And for me as a recruiter, you know, I want to have a really transparent conversation. I want to set you up for success, especially with the way that you know, the world is today. I want to make sure that everyone's paid equitably, but I also have to think about the internal team that's already there. And so I'll try and be as transparent with you about your expectations if you're transparent with me about it. And like you said, let's talk about it early. Um, let's see here. So we asked the audience, you know, what is the biggest mistake that people make when receiving an offer? I heard from a couple of people it was accepting an offer without considering if it was the right one, or not negotiating outside of base salary. I think we've touched a little bit on both of those, but Mallory, what are your thoughts on those two pieces, or are there other ones that you see a lot?
I think those are probably, you know, some of the bigger ones. I think, again, most importantly, like, do you want to work there? Is it, you know, the best next step for you? Do you feel connected? You know, hopefully you're going to be spending at least a year or 2 years plus working for this company. So, you know, making sure that you've gotten all the information that you need. Like, do you feel like you need to meet with additional people because of, you know, the current situation that we're in? Because I know a lot of, you know, companies are struggling with interview processes and trying to figure out the best way to do this. But, you know, in reality, it is harder to go through an interview process right now and still have that, you know, same connection. So I think also just not being afraid to ask if you need to meet with additional people or you need to get clarity on, you know, X, Y, and Z, you know, communicating that and making sure that you feel comfortable. Because you should be interviewing them just as much as they're interviewing you. And I think sometimes we forget that, especially, you know, as candidates. So I think that's another really important thing to think about.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And one thing I've noticed a lot, maybe not so much around negotiation, but just throughout the broader candidate process, is that candidates don't advocate for themselves as much as I think they should. You, as a recruiter, have to share that a lot of times we have a bunch of roles that we're managing all at once. And it's easy to lose people during that process. And so I always suggest that you should reach out, ask for prep, ask for feedback, you know, ask for what are the next steps in the process, continue to communicate where you're at in your interview, in your other interviews. I see that all the time. And I think that ends up in a situation where you're and maybe at offer and you're not ready, or like you said, you need to have more conversations, or you didn't feel like you were as prepared as you should be. We got another question from the audience. Who generally decides final compensation numbers if there's a disagreement? Is it the recruiter, the compensation team, or the hiring manager?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the company because everyone's kind of set up a little bit differently, but usually there's, you know, some type of range that, you know, probably has been approved by finance. And some companies, you know, it's up to the head of the department, but usually there is, you know, the finance team or the CEO, maybe if it's a smaller company, that it would have, you know, based on budgeting or compensation bands if they've had that in place, and again, internal equity. But I haven't seen it ever, at least in my history, been the recruiter making the decision.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've usually seen it's either the compensation team has a band, and what we mean by that, like there's just a range that's been predetermined for each level of role, how people should be paid. So usually a compensation team will have bands for specific functions as well as levels, and it's really hard to go outside of that or below that because obviously that'll impact internal equity. You know, but if it's on the cusp and you know, it fits within the finance team, I generally see it's the hiring manager with finance, because the hiring manager also knows their team and knows the impact that this role will have and how this person measures to the rest of their team that I've seen. Let's see, we've got another question. Thank you all for submitting questions. These are so great. How do you respectfully negotiate offers in a way that is forthcoming, but also doesn't put off the company? Candidates are worried, will I seem too pushy? Are there gender differences that you should think about? Mallory, how have you seen that come to fruition?
Yeah. So I think, just everything that we kind of talked about, and showing gratitude first and foremost, that you're excited about the offer. But again, hopefully you've had conversations about what your expectations are, and helping leverage the different things that you're asking for. So, hey, I reviewed the benefit package that you sent to me. Thank you so much. They look great. But, unfortunately, maybe, the benefits aren't as rich as this other offer, the company that I'm at. So I would really need an extra $5,000 or whatever it is, in order for me to feel comfortable moving forward with this offer. So I think, don't be scared of it. I know there are some, studies on, just gender norms with negotiation, especially around females not feeling like they can negotiate, or makes them not look appreciative, or just like, things that we normally do as opposed to our male counterparts. And I think that, if I remember correctly, that's some of the things that were based on why we have some of these laws in place, about not asking what the current salary is. So that way people have a fairer chance of getting, what their actual market value is. So that way that, it's not as hard of a discussion. So that way they, hopefully the recruiter or not is helping facilitate that, conversation about what the actual budget is for that role, and allows the person, if they're, applying for a different type of company, geography, et cetera, to get the market value for that particular role.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I definitely have seen that that gender difference a lot in technology, but also in venture. I have found that males just generally tend to have higher asks and feel more comfortable with higher asks, versus women can be a bit more tentative. So again, doing the research, making sure you're confident in what your skill set level is and the value you believe you should be getting. And if it's not coming in at that level, having an open and honest conversation with your recruiter about, like, I don't want to be wrong, I don't want to go outside your band, but like, this is feeling a little off to what I'm seeing in the market. Can you explain it to me? Yeah. Mallory, we have another question from the audience. This one says that I have an offer from an SF-based, San Francisco-based company, but I may be moving to another city. They are telling me that I may have to take a pay cut. Is that normal and reasonable? What should I do?
Yeah, so this is like a really hot topic right now as companies are trying to figure out what to do in this new world. And this is something that we've been talking to a lot of different companies when, building out their compensation processes. So a lot of companies, if they have, bands in place, they may also have geography bands. So they might have a tier A geography where it's like SF and, maybe New York City, depending on, where they are located. There might be a geography B, and there might be a percentage that, is going to be lower for that geography in order to, make it, more equitable for those different markets. So I would say that it's not abnormal, but I think there's, a lot of conversations on how this is all going to work. So some companies are not, putting those geography bans in place until after everyone is, back to work. I know a lot of companies that I've talked to are not doing the geography cuts unless it's a permanent move. So let's say the person is in New York City or their office is in New York City, but for the school year, they're moving to another location because they need help with childcare. Maybe they're moving, where their parents are. They're not necessarily going to, cut their salary until after they're requiring to be back in the office. or if they've decided to make a permanent move and they're not going to be returning to the city and being able to get to the office. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I agree with you. This is definitely a hot topic, and I think it may change with the pandemic and with remote work happening so much more. I've seen a lot of change in our venture community about what should I do. Actually, our head of people, Matt Hoffman, has talked about the fact that he really believes you shouldn't have geographic bans, that you should just pay people for the job that you think they do, and that should be competitive, generally within the United States. And then global, of course, has some different complexities to it as well. We have one last audience question. How do you negotiate when there is no recruiter and you are talking directly to a founder, hiring manager at a young, small startup? It's a tough question.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely more uncomfortable. I personally had to negotiate with, the manager that, I was going to be working with, at, a couple past lives. And that can be definitely uncomfortable. I think, again, going back to, all the things that we talked about, I don't think it necessarily changes, but just not being scared to having those conversations and, sharing what's important to you and why you're making the asks, and showing gratitude for the offer and, how excited you are to work with that person. And maybe even acknowledging that, hey, this is, an uncomfortable conversation, but, I want to feel good about this. And I know you want me to feel good about coming here.
Yeah, I've also found that a lot of times founders or hiring managers, maybe if they don't have a recruiter, may not be super educated on the market value or even the process. Like they may not know that they can't ask you for your compensation. So just making sure that you're armed with all the advice that Mallory and Liz have shared today, and going back to them and saying, hey, what is your budget? Let's talk about that and make sure I feel comfortable. And then negotiate with them and bring data. I always think data is super helpful. Actually, we did get one more, Mallory, and I'm curious if you have insight on this. I found it really hard to find benchmarking on equity percentages because it really depends on the company's stage and whether they're public or private. Do you have any suggestions on where people might be able to find information like that?
That's a really good question. I personally don't have a great recommendation, but I can give some tips on things to ask.
Yeah.
So I think first and foremost, you have to understand what is your level of risk. So I would really encourage people to take a step back and make sure that the offer is something that meets the needs of you and your family if you have one. Because I know sometimes people will take these offers where maybe they were given an option, which I've heard, sometimes happens, where you could take way more equity and have a lower base salary, or vice versa. So really understanding that. But, asking about, what type of equity you're getting. So is it an option, an RSU part, it could be profit sharing or whatnot. So understanding that, I would say Carta actually has a lot of information about what the differences with all of those are, because they are a lot of different tax implications that a lot of people don't know. And myself included, I learned some things the hard way working in startups, because I don't think that startups do a great job of really educating employees on, all the different things that can happen. There's long-term capital gains, short-term capital gains. You get taxed at certain points depending on the type of options. There's vesting things. There's some rude awakening where you actually have to purchase your options when you leave a company. And can you do that with the amount of options that you have to make it worthwhile for you to be getting these options if you, need to leave the company? So these are all different things that you kind of have to balance. But, understanding how many shares are outstanding, what the strike price is, and they think the value and why they think they're going to be successful, because the options ultimately will be worth nothing if the company's not successful, or the equity. So just understanding those pieces I think will be really important, and Carta could be a really great resource. They have a really good blog with a lot of different information on that.
Yeah, no, I think you brought up so many critical points, and I learned it the hard way too at a startup. Also realizing what stage the startup's at, because that will take longer for your equity to become liquid, whether through an acquisition or an exit. And so sometimes actually equity can expire. And if you're not at the company, if you're at the company, they may give you refreshes to help with that expired equity. But if you leave, it may no longer have value. So just like Mallory said, do your research. I think talking to a tax professional is important when you think about the long-term and short-term gains. Well, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate everyone asking all their questions, and Mallory for all of your input. It's been super fun talking with you. Do you have any final comments or anything you want to reiterate from the conversation that you want people to take away?
That's a good question. I think, thank you, for having me first and foremost. But I think most importantly, talk about compensation and what you're looking for early and often, and then showing gratitude when you do get an offer, and not being afraid of those conversations, because it's much harder once you actually get into a company to make changes, because you're in the performance reviews and whatnot. So it's really important to start out on the right foot and something that you're happy with.
No, I love that. And I guess on my end, I think recruiters are friends. So be honest with them, be transparent. We want to help you. We want you to be successful within the organization. So let's have a transparent conversation. Everyone, there will be a recording and a blog that will come out with all this information. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself. I don't want to volunteer Mallory, but I'm sure she'd be open to talking to you if you have any questions. And thank you all for joining. Thanks, Mallory.
Yeah, no problem. Bye-bye.